In popular culture, it's really common to categorize men as either being an alpha male or a beta male. An alpha is a very confident man who can walk into a social setting and the men will want to follow him and the women will want to date him. Whereas a beta male is a guy that lacks confidence and doesn't do very well in a setting where there are social dynamics. Now, I don't like that model. I think it's way too simplistic. Obviously, there are more types of men than just alphas and betas. In fact, I think there is an entire hierarchy of men. But fundamentally, I think that there are three categories of men. You can take most of the men in the world, and each one of them will fit into one of three different categories, and within that, there's a hierarchy. Let's talk about it. As I indicated in the opener, I think there are three categories of men. Now, this is a model that I've come up with based purely on my interest in this subject for a very long time, but I do think it has pretty good explanatory power, and I do think it matches up pretty well with observable reality. I think there are three categories of men, and there's a hierarchy there. I think this purely applies to men. I do think that women have their own hierarchy, but I'm not the person to explain that. This is purely about men. So what are the three categories? The three categories are leaders, followers, and loners. Leaders and followers tend to operate within a pretty symbiotic hierarchy. After all, leaders need someone to lead, and followers need someone to follow, so they tend to operate tightly together in a hierarchy. Loners, on the other hand, tend to operate outside the hierarchy. Loners typically don't want to lead anybody, and they don't want to follow anybody. Loners tend to be guys that are happiest when they're simply pursuing things that interest them without being part of a collective. Whereas followers, are men that like being part of a collective. They are men that like working within the context of a team. And it has to be noted that when I use the term followers, I am not using a term that is derogatory. In fact, I wish there was another term I could use, because the term follower tends to have a negative connotation in our modern society. We are so influenced by media, by advertising, by all the self-help books that tell you that you need to be a leader, right? But the reality is most men, probably at least half of all men, are naturally followers. And a follower is simply a guy that likes working within the context of a collective, likes being part of something that is bigger than themselves. That's all that it means to be a follower. Again, most men are followers, and the world literally could not work if there were no followers, because followers are the men that tend to do most of the work. Leaders don't really do the work, they just point in a direction. Followers do most of the work. Loners do work as well, but they don't do it within the context of a team. So it's critically important that you understand that a follower is not a derogatory category. A loner is not a derogatory category either. A loner tends to be someone who's introverted, not always, but sometimes, a lot of times, they tend to be introverted. So these are just categories that have no bearing on the quality of human being that you are. You can be a phenomenal human being who's a follower, and you can be a crappy guy who's a leader. So this is not there's no moral value, no moral judgment on this. These are just categories that have to do with your natural inclination as a man, how you're wired, your fundamental wiring. If you are someone who's introverted by nature, well, you're just wired that way. If you're outgoing by nature, you're just wired that way. So these three categories, they tend to be the categories that men naturally fall into. Some men are simply better suited as being leaders They just exude more natural confidence. Men naturally want to follow them, and they're just wired that way. Other men are followers, other men are loners. No moral judgment on this. It's just is what it is. It also needs to be noted that when I talk about these categories, I'm talking about your hard wiring. This is the way that you are pretty much innately wired. I'm not talking about artificial variables like wealth or fame, right? Wealth and fame, those can be status increasers for men. You can be a wealthy man who's famous, and now by virtue of that, you are a very high status man. But that might not be who you are by nature. I'm more interested in who we are in terms of our wiring, not who we appear to be based on artificial ingredients. Or in a corporate context, sometimes you see men that are in a leadership position. You're the vice president of a company. You might even be the CEO of a company, but yet you are not a leader by nature, and you make a terrible leader as a result of that. Or you see a loner that has been thrust into a leadership position or into a follower position, and they don't operate very well within those contexts. So we're talking about the person you naturally are, not the person that you maybe artificially appear to be. So in addition to these three categories of men, there is also a status line. And you can think of the status on, let's say, a scale of 1 to 10. What is your social standing as a man, right? A 5 being the average guy, an 8 being probably a confident guy who's higher status by virtue of being more dynamic and more, someone who's more commanding, or a 10 who is the true alpha male, a natural alpha who is just insanely confident and just very high status by nature, right? There is a status there, social status. There's also a sexual component to this. It isn't just social. There's a sexual component to this because the status of woman that you will attract is directly correlated to your status as a man. Women are hypergamous. Hypergamy is the tendency of a woman to want to increase her status by virtue of her mate. In other words, women tend to want to marry up in stature. So women will generally choose a mate that's either at their level, or they'll choose a mate that is slightly higher in status. So if, for example, as a man, you are able to attract a woman that's, let's say, a 7 in terms of looks and qualities of a woman, however you define that, then it's highly likely that you are probably either a 7 or maybe slightly higher than that. Maybe you're an 8. So that's generally how it works. So there's a social hierarchy and there's a sexual hierarchy that these things tend to be pretty well aligned, because the type of mate that you can attract will be a good indicator of your status. And again, absent artificial ingredients. Now, at the top of the food chain, you have the alpha males. An alpha is someone that will fight to retain their position at the top of the pecking order. Think about the Lion King. The king of the jungle. There can only be one Lion King in that pride, and men will fight for that position. Other alphas will fight for that position. And so generally, you don't want to have two alphas that are working together within the context of a company or within the context of some, goal structure that these men need to meet, because oftentimes there will be rivalries there. On the other hand, just a notch lower, you will find men that are very high status, but they are not alphas. And one of the indicators that they're not alphas is generally those men are able to work together pretty effectively under the direction of the alpha. So if you think of, let's say, a sports team, for example, the alpha might be the head coach. Let's say it's a football team. The head coach is the alpha. The assistant coaches are the high status males who are not alphas, but they're pretty confident and they are, high status. And then you have the followers who are the men on the team. And within the followers, you will have higher status followers that do have leadership capability. For example, the quarterback, or maybe on the defensive side, a defensive member of the team who assumes a leadership role. And so even though I showed the leader and follower categories as separate categories, in reality, they look more like this. There is a gradient there where at the very top you have men that are clear leaders, and at that upper level where there's a gradient, you have men that are, they're generally followers by nature, but they are higher status followers that have leadership capability within certain context. Maybe you're the foreman on a job site, or maybe you are in the military and you lead a small group, or maybe you're the department head in a company. But in the presence of true leaders, you will probably not appear to be a leader of that level. So there's a hierarchy there, and there's a gradient there. In the loner category, you also have a hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy, you have men that are every bit as much of an alpha as an alpha who is in the hierarchy as a leader. However, the loner doesn't want to lead. The classic example of the alpha who is a loner would be James Bond, right? This is a guy who is incredibly attractive to women. He's an attractive guy who's capable, who's a confident alpha, but he operates outside of the hierarchy. Or you can think of all the Clint Eastwood characters that he played, like Dirty Harry, or all the Westerns where he played the lone, the loner alpha cowboy who was very much alpha, but he was not in the hierarchy. And within the loner category, of course, that hierarchy will go all the way down to the bottom end, in which you have men who are complete loners, but they are very low status. And what makes them low status is they have no social ability whatsoever. Maybe they don't groom themselves. Maybe they don't understand how to dress well. Maybe they're overweight. Maybe they sit in their basement playing video games all day. They're just not even in the game. In a social scenario, they will literally be invisible to women. Now, what's interesting to me is that sometimes guys that are very low status, who are loners, when they are young, they are simply low status because they haven't learned any social skills yet. And sometimes they are proclaimed to be outcasts, or they're proclaimed to be losers when they're in high school, because they're just running off chasing the things they're interested in, and they don't know how to relate to other human beings. But sometimes those young boys, as they mature and become adults, they get it together. They learn social dynamics, they learn how to be confident and all that stuff. And sometimes those guys will actually become the James Bond character. They will become alphas. Not always, that's rare, but there is a pathway there, which I find real interesting. And of course, everything in between. So the question is, why is this important to understand? Well, I think this is important for a few reasons. Number one, it's just interesting because as men, we should understand the dynamic out there. We should understand a little bit about ourselves and where we fit within the hierarchy of men. We should understand whether we're a leader naturally, whether we're a follower, or whether we are a loner. And if we are attempting to improve ourselves, we should try to do it within the context of who we are. So understanding who we are is pretty important in that. If you are an employer, if you own a company, this information is actually critically important as well, because The way you assemble teams together is going to determine whether you're successful or not successful. And I've seen it. You have the CEO of a company who is trying to get this person who is a loner to function within a team setting, and the loner simply doesn't have the ability to do that very well. If you understand these things, it's far more productive if you can give the loner some tasks, or maybe you make them their own department and let them simply do things they're good at. Or if you have someone that you have elevated to a position of leadership, maybe just because they've been working at that company for a very long time, well, maybe they don't deserve to be in a position of leadership because they're not suited for that position. So those are a couple reasons why you might find this useful. So here's a question. Is it possible to jump categories? And this is an interesting question to me, and I think it's kind of an open question because I'm not a behavioral psychologist. In other words, if you are an introvert by nature, can you so effectively learn to mimic traits of extroversion that in doing so, you will be able to turn yourself into an extrovert? Is that possible? Maybe. My intuition says that, we are very adaptable. Maybe that's possible, but I have a feeling that that takes a huge amount of effort, and it's probably going to result in a lot of stress because you're trying to take yourself from something that you are and turn yourself into something that you're not. So personally, I think a far better strategy, instead of trying to recategorize yourself, maybe just try to turn yourself into the best version of yourself, right? If you're trying to recategorize yourself, it means you're in the canoe rowing against the current. You're going against your nature, whereas if you flow with the current, now you are moving with your nature, but you're simply trying to improve your nature. In other words, let's say you are a man that's a 5. You're an average guy, you're a follower. And you embark on a quest to improve yourself. You decide to make yourself a better conversationalist. You learn how to make eye contact and be a more confident person. You learn how to engage in social settings better. You learn to be more interesting. You learn to be more disciplined. You become more determined, you become more motivated, you learn to be better within your relationships, you learn to be more empathic, you learn to be a better listener, you learn to be a more patient person, you learn, all of these things, and in doing so, you take yourself from, let's say, a 5 to a 7. And this is a massive improvement that you've been able to do with yourself, right? You're still a follower. You have done it within the category that you naturally are part of, but you have brought yourself to a very high level of performance within that category without trying to jump to becoming, let's say, a true leader, because that's not really in your nature. Or let's say you are a loner who is a 4, right? You have problems with grooming. You don't take care of yourself, you're overweight, you're just terrible in social situations, you're literally invisible to women. Well, you embark on this journey of betterment. You don't try to become something from a different category. You simply try to turn yourself into the best loner possible, right? You embrace the fact that you are an introvert and you like doing things by yourself, but you improve yourself drastically within the context of that. And maybe you turn yourself into an 8. After years of work, and in some ways the work is never ending, you bring yourself to a really high level of performance. And in doing so, you're happier, you're more actualized, you attract a much better mate, and so on and so forth. So I think as a strategy, instead of trying to become something you're not, work within your category to become the best version of yourself. So those are my thoughts on the matter. Hopefully you find this interesting. I think it's fascinating, if for no other reason than it's real interesting to understand these dynamics. All right, talk to you later.